Hi, this is Fantom from Roland, the flagship workstation for their new Zencore-based product line as of 2019. This has been out for a while, but Roland now announced extended sampling and multi-sampling capabilities. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the new features in firmware 2.0 as well as the entire workflow, including pros and cons compared to the alternatives. Let's get started. Let's start with an overview, and I'll put the cart before the horse in this video and talk about the new 2.0 features and the rest of the capabilities of Fantom in that context. By the way, as usual, reviews on this channel are never paid, but in the interest of full disclosure, while there was a cost to this for me, it was less than retail. As usual, the opinions in this video are all my own, pros, cons, and all. Anyway, the general idea with Fantom is to give performers and players the broadest set of sounds possible, with the goal of being a central hub for sequencing both the onboard sounds as well as external gear. It has plenty of connectivity and a very tight integration with Mainstage and Logic if you want to complement the internal sounds with sounds on a computer. It comes with over 3,500 built-in sounds in plenty of categories: pianos, electronic pianos, organs, keys, guitars, bass, and so on. You can drill down into each of these categories to expose more sounds. These also include various sample effects, categories, and drums. And you can download thousands more free from Roland's Axial website. It has up to 256 voice polyphony and is 16-part multi-timbral, meaning that you can split up the keyboard and sequence 16 different sounds. So a project could have multiple tracks or zones, as they're called here, each with their different sound and different patterns as well. So you could move along a project with an Ableton Live style grid, launching different clips for the different zones or tracks. Technically, clips can only contain note data, not samples, but with the new 2.0 update, you could assign a whole song to a note, and I'll show you how to do that in a bit. It just won't time stretch to the tempo of your project. And you can either perform this grid live or sequence the different groups of patterns into a song. I'll show you a bit of that later on. Now, Fantom has a few built-in sound engines. Most of the tones are based on the Zencore engine, both for tones and for drums. So let's take, for example, this sound. A Zencore tone is built out of 4 partials. Each partial is more than an oscillator. It can play samples or oscillator wave shapes. So it's basically up to 4 different layers. Each of these layers has their own pitch and pitch envelope parameters, filter and filter envelope parameters, LFOs, little mod matrix, again, each for every partial individually, and these are layered together into a tone. And again, a tone lives in a zone, and there are 16 of these zones, each capable of holding a different tone. Aside from the Zencore engine, there are a few other engines in here. The Supernatural engine, which in effect is a group of simplified mini-engines optimized for acoustic instruments. The drum engine is also very similar to the Zencore engine. It lets you layer 4 layers of drums rather than partials or oscillators, but it only supports samples. Then there's the Virtual Piano engine, which is accessible in here. That's the vPiano engine, and it has its own set of parameters. The idea here is that it's based on an algorithmic model of a piano rather than samples. And there's also a vocoder that can be applied to the audio input. One of the main things that's new in version 2.0 of the firmware is that the partials or the oscillators can play not only internal samples from the internal memory and from expansions, but also samples, user samples basically, and user multi-samples. Multi-sampled instruments are instruments where you sample multiple keys across a broad range of pitches and potentially velocities, as opposed to just pitching a single sample up and down the keyboard range. An instrument that's multi-samples, that contain multiple samples, makes for a more natural sounding instrument and is a great way to bring in both software plugins from a computer as well as hardware instruments like synths into the box with you. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that the entire instrument's features are replicated within one multi-sample, but you can pretty faithfully bring in a single preset with its unique sound in many cases. Continuing with the overview, there are 3 versions of Fantom: Fantom-06, Fantom-07, which has an extra octave, and Fantom-08, which has weighted keys, but aside from that, and the extra octaves, all 3 have identical features. The front panel is fairly straightforward. To the left of the screen is the zones section. Zones are the different parts or tracks or timbres you want to play, like I mentioned. There are 16 of them. You can toggle and select the zones using this button. And you've got quick access to panning for each of the zones and level for each of the zones, as well as you can use these knobs and faders to control internal or external synths. There aren't that many shift functions here, by the way, but there is a shift button. So say if you wanted to assign one of these, let's say this fader, just hit shift, press this, and you have access to all the parameters that you can assign it to. Mainly MIDI CCs and a few expression options. Moving on to the center, you've got the touch screen and a few associated control shortcuts. There are 6 press encoders that control the parameters right above them. So say if I go into here, you can change the parameters that are on screen. And these are also push encoders that can either change parameters or, if you're in a menu somewhere, also make selections. You can also navigate around the screen using the arrow keys. So if you don't like using touchscreens, you can get around it in most cases. You can increase or decrease parameters either with the increase or decrease buttons or with this rotary encoder. Anyway, moving on with the overview, to the right of the screen are the main sound design controls over here on top. These are nice and useful, but realistically there are substantially more sound design parameters per tone than what you have access to over here. So you've got the basics, things like filter cutoff and choosing an oscillator type and so on. More often than not, you'll just be pressing these parameter buttons for quicker access to functions over here. So you can scroll through all the oscillator or tone parameters using the menu here, or use these quick shortcuts to oscillator parameters, the filter parameters, envelopes, and effects parameters. Below the sound design section is the sequencer section. Like I mentioned earlier, you've got patterns and can enter notes into the patterns either using a step sequencer, by step sequencing using the keyboard, or by playing live into a pattern. You can group patterns into a group and then sequence groups into a song. Then to the far right are 16 pads. These aren't velocity sensitive, but they're not intended for finger drumming. They can be used for playing back samples or for triggering clips. But these clips or samples aren't related to the patterns. They're actually samples that are completely standalone from anything going on in your project or scene. More on this in a bit. The point was to say that these pads can launch samples, but they also have a bunch of other functions. We'll look into this a bit deeper in a bit as well. Final word for the overview, the sound engine in Fantom is almost all digital, but it does have one analog filter, actually a stereo pair, which can be driven to sound pretty nice and have a few options, including gain and drive and a few filter types. But it's not like you have a set of analog filters per tone or per voice. Rather, there are a global set of 2 actual physical filters that you can choose to route any one of the zones to. You also can't modulate them, at least not in the current version of the firmware. So it's mainly for either a static setting or manual motion with your hands. Before we look into the details, a word about connectivity. First thing, kudos for having labels here on top so you know where everything is without looking over the back. On the back are 2 XLR outputs which are balanced, then 2 unbalanced outputs, 2 sub outputs which you can route zones to, separate analog filter outs, and then a pair of CV gate outputs. There's 1 USB type A jack to connect a memory stick to, and a USB type B jack to hook up to your computer. Like I mentioned before, this can interface with Logic or MainStage for DAW control, as well as transfer 16 stereo tracks out over USB and 3 stereo tracks in over USB. Aside from those two jacks, you've got 3 additional USB Type A jacks to connect external keyboards to this, and who knows potentially what else in the future. And on the right, you've got 2 inputs, either line or mic with Fantom power, both of them balanced. 4 pedal inputs, MIDI in, out, and through, which can optionally be a second MIDI out to control even more gear. So fantastic connectivity on the back, great labeling on top. If I had to complain about one thing, it's that the headphone jack is in the back, as opposed to, say, being up front, but at least it's on the sides, so it's somewhat easy to bring the headphone cable around. Okay, so that's it for the overview. Let's take a look at the details of what's new, and the biggest deal is the addition of user samples and user multi-sample playback capabilities as an integral part of the Zencore engine. So previously, before version 2, you could load up custom samples into 64 slots that lived in the sample pads, like I mentioned earlier. However, the only thing you could do with those samples is trigger them manually and have them loop. You couldn't pitch them, time them automatically to your scene, or trigger them from a pattern. They were also and still are global for Fantom, so regardless of which scene you pick, and which sound you want to play, so, let's pick this. Okay, or this one. The sample pads will still always make the same sound regardless of the scene. With firmware version 2.0, Roland have introduced a new sample type called keyboard samples. These live in a completely different area of the memory than the pad samples, in 2 gigabytes of storage that are shared, by the way, with the Axial expansion packs. So if I go into the sampling menu, previously you only had these 2 options, now you have these 4 options, and if I click here on the memory info, you could see these are my expansions, or the memory taken by the expansions that I installed, and this is the memory taken by the keyboard samples. These 2 gigabytes are shared. If I go into expansion info, you can see these are the ones that I have installed. There are about 6 of them. So if you installed all 15, your memory bar is probably around here somewhere. The more user samples you want to add, the more likely you'll need to remove some of the expansions. Now, you can load up to 8,000 individual samples into this memory. Each sample can't be over 2 minutes and 44 seconds, I'm told, but you can fill this up and all this can live simultaneously and be used by tones on your Fantom. These 4 additional new options let you sample into the keyboard or to the storage, or import samples from a USB stick again to the keyboard, meaning a tone that plays the same sample across the keyboard, or to create a multi-sample, meaning a tone that has multiple samples across the keyboard. So let's start with a simple 1 sample per keyboard, but I will take this to an extreme and take a track from my album. Now, one important thing, and I don't have confirmation for this for Roland, but I found from my experiments that samples at a sample rate of 48 kilohertz work best. If you bring in 44.1, I think the internal engine changes them to 48 kilohertz, and along the way, I saw there was a bit of a reduction in quality. You may or may not notice this. I noticed that 48K work best. Anyway, you hit import. You need to choose the key that will trigger the sample at its original rate. You can preview it. And then choose a destination tone. So let's put it in an empty slot, say in here. You can choose to add emphasis or not, which I think is a high frequency EQ. Let's turn this off. You can also save it to the internal storage. Again, this is separate storage, sort of like an additional backup that lives along with the pad samples and doesn't take up from your 2 gig memory. And you can have the sample play as a one-shot, loop backwards once or multiple times, and loop forwards. We'll get to that in a bit, but let's maybe keep it as a one-shot and then hit execute. Are you sure? Yes. Now this is a full song, so it takes a bit, and even shorter samples take a bit longer. I'll fast forward this. Now I didn't start out with an init tone, but let's do that. So if I go ahead and edit this, let's just start with a completely blank tone. I could go ahead into the wave group type, choose sample, then go into here and look for the last one, which is this guy. And when I play C4, I get my entire track, which is really nice. And when I play lower than C4, I'll get it slowed down gradually, as samples tend to do, or play it chipmunk style. By the way, if you're into generative experimentation, play these two samples, say, an octave apart, or a fifth. Anyway, my point here was to show that you can load up pretty big samples. This is about a 2-minute song. If I play it real fast here. And that it changes drastically whether you play it low or high, which is why you need multi-samples. But before we talk about multi-samples, let's see how we can edit this into something else. So I go into sampling, then go into edit keyboard sample, which is where it lives. And then I have access to all the keyboard samples that I experimented with. And the last one is this guy. The wave edit options are very similar to the other ones for the pads. So I could preview it, choose a different start point, zoom in and out. So you could see that it's a really long sample. It renders slowly, but again, this is like a 2-minute song. And I could choose, say, a different endpoint. And let's maybe zoom into that. And there's no cursor, which would have been nice and useful to see where we're at within this sample. Let's move this a bit more aggressively. Okay, so I want more than that. I could zoom in some more. Let's maybe chop it up here. And I could set a loop point, say here, just for fun. And I do need to turn on looping, of course. So looping, like I mentioned, can be either one shot, loop forward. And you can hear the click here. It would have been nice if there was a zero crossing option or crossfade option. So you sort of need to hunt and peck for the right spot if you want to loop samples. And there's a reverse looping option as well. And just for the heck of it, let's do one shot reverse. So I could save this if I wanted. This would change the actual sample in the slot that I imported. There are also a few modification options here. I could truncate it or say normalize the sample. And lesson learned, truncate before you normalize. Let's speed this up too. So let's do that now. Let's hit truncate. These actions do take time, so let's fast forward this again. And let's write to save this. It's okay, overwrite it, yes. Anyway, this is the instrument we created, which is pretty neat, but isn't a multi-sample, so let's talk about multi-samples. So like I mentioned earlier, multi-sampling is the process whereby you take an external synth or a plugin on your computer and sample multiple keys across the keyboard. Now, if you're lazy like me, you want to avoid doing this manually because the process of sampling even a single note every octave, not to mention multiple velocities, then chopping up those samples and normalizing them manually is a pain. Unfortunately, currently there's no automated process for this within Fantom, but there are a number of third-party hardware and software solutions that can do this. For example, the MPC One has an auto sample function and you can drag and drop those right into a USB stick and bring that into here. And there are software multi-samplers like MainStage on a Mac and Sample Robot, which works both on a Mac and on a PC. So let's try this out. I'll go into sampling and press import to multi-sample. And once you have that, let's go into, say, over here, I've sampled Una Corda by Native Instruments. There are great pianos here, but Fantom doesn't have a felt piano. So I multi-sampled Una Corda using Sample Robot. As you can see, I tried 44.1 before, but 48K works better. And you want to make sure that the sample names have the note number and the note itself. And then you can just hit Shift and down to select them all. I only sampled every octave. Ideally, you'd sample every 6 semitones, let's say at least. And I only sampled one velocity. Anyway, you hit import, and I'll leave normalize on in this case because I'm only going for one velocity layer, but I'll take off emphasis and let's have it create a tone for us. And let's not overwrite our beautiful other tone. And you can rename it. Let's clear this and say, call it una corda loop up for here, should be good enough. And then hit execute. Now it's going to take those samples and import them into a single multi-sample type sample. And this takes a while. These samples are pretty short, actually, unlike the song I imported before. And still, this does take a while. So let's just cut to the chase. And we're done. Okay, now ideally what you'd want to have happen is for Fantom to identify what the samples are, either by name or using an advanced algorithm by pitch, but certainly by name would be nice. It doesn't do that currently, so you need to go ahead and match the note number or note itself to the sample. So I'll just go with a number 24 to 24, and then 36 to 36, and I'm going to fast forward this for you. So not fun, but not too painful. You could also preview the samples if you want. And edit the waveforms if you wanted. But let's just hit next. And now we have a multi-sampled felt piano for the Fantom. Now, if we go into tone edit, we can go ahead and edit this just like any other tone and apply any other processing, filters, envelopes, LFOs, and so on. Matrix, this is just an oscillator, just like any other oscillator within a partial within a tone. Now, what Fantom did behind the scenes is pretty cool. If I go to edit multi-sample, we could create different keyboard velocity ranges had I sampled una corda at different velocities. You need to create these manually, unfortunately. Again, there's no batch import for sample pitch and sample velocity. But just to show you what Fantom did behind the scenes, if I go here into edit, you can see that each sample is spread out across the keyboard based on the notes that are closest to it. And you can edit these ranges if you want. You'll notice that since I sampled every octave, sort of as the tones overlap, they're not the same, right? So this is the flaw of having a multi-sample every octave, right? That's where these ranges overlap, but it's still very nice, I think. Now, you don't have to batch import multi-samples like this. You can take any sample out of the 8,000 samples in the memory, right? So you can scroll through them very quickly. And yeah, I messed things up totally now, but you can bring in your own samples to a multi-sample. So you could put any sample you want anywhere across the keyboard. So those are samples and multi-sampling. Aside from importing from a USB stick, you could sample directly to the keyboard or to the storage. So just for fun, let's maybe select randomly a different scene. So let's say that I wanted to resample, this into the keyboard as a multi-sample. I'd go into here, go to sampling. If I had an external synth, I could sample that. I could choose a sampling mode, which is either resampling the keyboard and the input, or just the keyboard. This is very similar to pad sampling, except you have this section in the middle where you tell Fantom what you're sampling and which note you're sampling. So let's just hit start and then play that and stop. And this can take a few seconds to complete. So that's what I sampled. Again, it would be nice if there was a playhead here. Let's go ahead and hit OK. Yeah, sampling editing here isn't as fast as, say, on the MPC. So you do need a bit of patience. I'll fast forward this. And I could go ahead and zoom in and out. Modify, let's normalize, yes, I'm sure. I'll fast forward again. This does take a little bit too long. Let's just quickly set a start point and an end point. It's good enough. Modify, truncate, yes, yes. Since storage space is relatively limited if you're into sampling, it's good practice to keep on truncating samples as much as you can. And let's hit right, save, yes, rename, clear C major, bell. Okay. And let's go into utility and assign to keyboard. This is fine, this tone, select, yes, I'm sure. So we could play this across the keyboard. At C4, it sounds like what we sampled. Obviously faster the higher we play. Yeah, and that's pretty much it for the new sampling features. Okay, so those are the big sampling features added in Fantom version 2.0. Now, I won't go over all the new features in 2.0, but there are a few extra important ones that are noteworthy. The next two are the new piano roll, automation, and microscope features. To understand them, if you're not familiar with Fantom, some background about sequencing. Sequencing is done within patterns, within different zones. Right now I'm in zone 1 and I've got my una corda piano. So there are three basic ways to sequence. You can step record a pattern. So let's say which would sound like this. I could speed it up. So that's step recording, and there are a bunch of options here. We won't go through them. Then the next option is TR rec, TR recording, TR style recording. I can desecrate Bach and sequence a drum pattern over this. This is all for science, right? You understand? So I could hit TR rec, then choose what I wanted to sequence. And yeah, just hit that. Real velocity, let's keep it soft. Then just sequence, say a kick. Yeah, and we can add hi-hats if we wanted. Again, keep it low. Actually, that was pretty nice. Cool, anyway, so let's stop that. And you can TR-rec not just drums, but chords as well. So you just hit a chord and then add it wherever you want within the sequence. And then let's just keep this low for a bit. The final option is playing live into a sequence. Anyway, we've got our pattern. Let's go into zone 1. So the first new feature is microscope editing. Let's hit that. This is pretty nice because it lets you scroll through and see the events in order as opposed to on a piano roll, which is hard to edit on a touchscreen. And then you can go ahead and just edit the notes if you wanted. We've heard Bach enough, so I won't do it, but you get the idea. You can delete notes, move, create, erase, and so on. And then the second new feature that was added here, let's go back into edit again, into the piano roll, is the ability to draw automation for multiple CCs as well as aftertouch and pitch bend. So I could choose, for example, to say, let's pitch bend Bach, why not? Anyway, get this going and just draw an occasional pitch bend. This is going to hurt. It's a little detuned, well-tempered piano. And yeah, we can change that if we want to have it less extreme. And like I said, there are a bunch of other things you could automate. You can draw a filter cutoff. Let's go into here into draw. And yeah, we've caused enough damage, I think. Let's just add a resonance automation. Why not? We can start this lower. So now you can hear the filter opening up and closing as well as resonance. Anyway, that's automation and microscope on the piano roll. Okay, let's change pace a bit and look at a few other features. By the way, one thing that I wish they would change is that if you change a scene now, so after we've created this masterpiece, right, and we were just to change this scene, it's now all gone. If I go back into here, that's what I had saved previously, but you don't have that lovely pitch bend that I added or the filter motion. So it would be nice if it would let you undo a scene change or undo the data that's deleted when you change scenes. Anyway, a small new feature, but it'll be a good excuse to talk about scenes and chains. So scenes are basically this, right? A different state for the machine for all the zones, different patterns. Now you can chain scenes for easy access and a performance, and you can create a ton of those. Let's just go into here. 3 is fine. Initial scene. So I could go into this and edit this and say select, let's take this scene, for example, add it to the chain, and then select this scene and add it to the chain, and then maybe add one more, let's say on a completely different page. I have no idea what I'm loading, but let's do one more from a completely different page. That should do. Okay. So the idea is that you have easy access to these scenes using these buttons. So I could play this, then move to this. I love it, by the way, that sounds don't die down when you change scenes in Fantom, which is awesome. Anyway, so what's new here is that you can add markers to scene. Let's say marker 0 and marker 1, and let's write this to save it. So presumably, if we have more than just these scenes, we could jump between the markers to specific ones, right? Or just at the start and end, hit OK. And if we hit Shift Chain, there's also another view which shows you both the markers and the names of the scenes. Now, chains, by the way, aren't how you build songs here. Unlike other sequencers, chains are just quick access to scenes. If you want to build a song, let's go into pattern. I'll cover this very briefly. Anyway, the way you build a song, I mean, you could just play entire rows manually, but you can also select different patterns. Let's just, you know what, let's just start with a simple quiet group. Let's do this. Maybe even turn this off. Stop this. So I've got this and this. Yeah, let's unselect this. Anyway, I have these two selected, go into grouping, then choose the group that I want to assign these to, and I could rename this to intro, and OK, set, yes. Let's maybe create another group with this, a long press so that it doesn't play, hit grouping, create this, rename, let's just call this, you know what, B is fine. And then set. Yes. Cool. So those are two groups, and I can obviously go ahead and create more. And then I could have a look at the groups, and here we go. Change their length if I wanted. But let's just keep it like this. Then hit make song, and then say add this group, and then add this group twice. And hopefully you get the idea. This is my song. I hit play. Oops. Group intro is playing. Then group B will play twice. So that's how you make songs. You can export this not as a wave, I think, just as MIDI files. Anyway, so that is patterns, groups, and songs. Moving on, the next topic on the agenda is effects. Every tone has its own effect. That's called an M effect. So let's maybe go ahead and just choose a simple single tone scene. I go ahead, change this M effect. The M effect can be any one of 90 effects. Most of the effects that you choose, by the way, are one of multiple effects. You can see all of them here. Obviously, we won't go through all of them, but they are quite nice. Anyway, those are the types of effects. A tone, each and every one of the tones gets a single individual M effect, which, like I said, you change over here. Let's just cancel this. Now, aside from this, you could see the effect layouts really nicely in the effects edit screen. So the tone-specific effects are the M effects. Then you can route the audio, like I mentioned earlier, to the analog filter as well, or to any one of the sub outputs, but let's just keep it on main. And then there are 4 overall effects, overall scene effects, reverb and chorus. You get a send for each and every one of those, and you can see that in a lot of places, but in the mixer as well. So if I wanted a larger reverb send, I could do this, add a chorus here as well. Anyway, those are send effects, and you also have 2 additional iFX insert effects. They're just anything you want, and they can be routed in series or in parallel. And they can also be any one of these 90 effects. And if we ease on down the road here through the chorus, reverb, and analog filter, we can see the entire chain. So what's new, you ask? The first thing is the master effects, the T effects. That's applied to everything and can be saved as a global effect. And you guessed it, it can be any one of the 90 different effects. So that is the first new thing in 2.0. That's the total effect, or TFX. And then the second new effect is an effect that can be applied to the audio input. So if you're bringing in a synth on the audio in, there's an M effects for the audio input. Again, one of 90 effects. Another small feature that gives us an excuse to look at zone view. You can look at the zones either at 1 zone, 4 zones, 8 zones, and 16 zones. That's an overall view. I didn't mention this earlier. You select the active zone by pressing these buttons, and then you can choose which zones the keyboard gets sent to using these buttons. Now, by default, these buttons send the keyboard to internal sounds. However, and if we go to the zone menu, we could see that here as well. So I could activate zones for internal sounds. If I hit Shift and press a zone, I could swap between internal and external. That's how it used to be before 2.0, and now a new feature which was added, which we need to enable in the settings. And you need to enable this only once if you save your settings, which I didn't. So let's change it to advanced. Anyway, now we get 3 options here, internal, external, or both. And we'll see this over here as well. You can tap here, both, or Shift tap, internal, external, and both. Next feature, again, excuse to talk about the pads, is a new group play pad mode. Remember the groups we created before? You could launch those groups using the pads now. Let's briefly look at other interesting pad modes. You can change keyboard controls, so which zones are controlled using these pads. You can launch different patterns on the grid using the pads here. So if we go into the pattern grid and view this, we can move around the grid. Truly Ableton Live style. It would be nice, by the way, if you could hook up a launch pad into this and control the entire grid. That would be cool. And while we're on the pads, this is a great excuse to talk about another feature we didn't cover, which is rhythm patterns. So rhythm patterns are basically different drum grooves in multiple genres. If you're too cool to get help sequencing drums and you're proficient in all of these different genres, then great. But if not, and you can do with a little help from your friends, you've got intro and verse options, fills. Oops, yep. Hang on. Okay. And fills. Yeah, just takes its time. That's the fill, not much of a fill. Okay, verse 2. And anyway, what got us here are these pads. Go to ending. And if you wanted, you could, okay, thank you, drummer, also sequence these into the patterns. Finally, another feature that was added into the drum instruments is a zoom view for the drum tones. Now, unlike everything else I mentioned, this is a topic that's just too much to include in this video, which is getting long as is. So if you want to see a dedicated video about Zencore tone and drum sound design in the future, let me know in the comment section below. It's a big topic, but I'll cover it if there is interest. So this has been an overview of what's new and pretty much all the features of Fantom. I think the only things I didn't cover were the arpeggiator and chords. So let's just mention them briefly. You have a simple arpeggiator, but there are a bunch of other options, both rhythmic and not, with variations and different motifs, including chords and different phrases. Clearly, we're not going to go through all of these, but you can see there's a long list available. Then there's a chord option that works with or without the arpeggiator. And it has a strum option, as you can hear, which is velocity sensitive. The lighter you play, the slower it plays. You can strum up or down, or turn off strum. And there are a whole bunch of options here as well. Anyway, we won't go through all these, but you get the idea. Then finally, there's DAW control, which gives you access to an excellent and deep integration, both with MainStage and Logic. And it should probably say, please connect to Mac here, guys, because so far there are only integration with those DAWs, I think. Or better yet, it would be nice to see an integration with Ableton Live, both for device controls and for clip launching with the pads. Anyway, Roland have a few good videos about how this works, so I won't cover that here. So believe it or not, we covered all the basics. Let's talk about the pros and cons. Now, that's a big topic because you can compare Fantom to anything from a DAW to other workstation keyboards to production platforms like the MPC or Machine, all the way down to simple groove boxes. Overall, on the pros side, I felt that Fantom was relatively easy to learn. I obviously haven't mastered it, but I think getting a feel as to how to get to what you want is relatively straightforward, and despite that, you don't compromise much in terms of power. Yep, and even when it comes to sound design, which we didn't talk much about in this video, if you're coming at this from the perspective of a performance that includes a large number of diverse sounds, while Fantom isn't a knob per function synth, the diversity of sounds here more than makes up for the lack of knob for every synth parameter. That said, some of the functions here obviously I wish were faster, like sample slicing or mapping controls to synth parameters. Currently, you can't just map a parameter to a knob, you have to first assign a knob to something, to a MIDI CC, and then go to the mod matrix and assign that CC to a destination. So that workflow is a bit slow. Like you saw earlier, sampling, chopping, truncating samples, that also is fairly slow compared to the competition. Now again, when I say competition, I'm looking mainly at samplers. I think with other workstations, they have their issues in that respect as well. The touchscreen is capacitive, but not as responsive as your phone, which is a good excuse to show this feature. So you can see there's a bit of a lag, but it's not too crazy. This, by the way, is a function that crossfades between 4 zones while we're on the topic. So overall, I feel like for the bigger buttons, they get hit well every time. Maybe for the smaller ones, which you're probably better off using the arrows anyway, or the knobs. On the cons side, Fantom isn't cheap. It's extremely well built, but starting at $3,300, it may price out a lot of people. I think it would be nice if Roland came out with a cheaper, lighter model, maybe with a few fewer controls to bring more people to this platform. Beside that, one thing that I found slows down the workflow is that you can't save a scene along with any changes you made to the tones in it. You need to save the tones first and then save the scene. It would be nice to just have a single button to save everything. And while we're on that topic, if you didn't save a scene and swapped it out, like I mentioned earlier, it would be nice to have a snapshot of the previous scene or just be able to undo that. The analog filter I think is really nice. It would be nicer if they added some modulation options to it. And finally, in terms of storage, it has become a little bit more confusing now that there are 2 types of memory. One for the samples and the sample pads and overall storage, and then another one for the keyboard samples and the multi-samples. And the fact that this memory, while 2 gigabytes, so at least it's not 64 megabytes, but that said, it would be nice if this were slightly more unlimited, maybe potentially using these jacks for additional memory. It would just be great to bring in a ton of multi-samples from any plugin or hardware synth in the world and just bring that all into this. While we're on the topic of multi-sampling, it would be nice if there was an automated process here, both for multi-sampling from the device itself, either through MIDI to a plugin or to a hardware synth, as well as sampling different velocity layers. And as far as editing individual samples aside from a running cursor, it would be nice if there was a crossfade option for the loop. So that's it for the pros and cons. Bottom line, I think if you're performing, whether on your own or in a band, whether with an external synth, a computer, or just with this standalone, and you need a keyboard with a broad range of sounds and a bank of sequenced patterns and songs ready to go for a show, Fantom can be a very worthy partner in a single package that just works. That's it for Fantom. If you enjoyed the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell after subscribing to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.